Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight, and welcome to this evening's webinar, Who is Deborah? Illuminating the Deborah Story. Tonight's webinar is hosted by JOFA, and it is the latest installment in our webinar series, which began approximately 2 years ago. My name is Rachel Lieberman, and I'm the Assistant Director at JOFA, and I'm very excited to welcome all of you. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. There is a link to a question form in the first line of the description underneath the screen. And if you have any questions for our presenter, Debra Band, please feel free to submit them throughout the webinar using the form. And we will have a chance to answer those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. The second housekeeping note is that the majority of this webinar will be a slide presentation. So for optimal viewing, please use the full screen button at the bottom of your screen to expand the video to fit your screen. So now let's jump into the content. I am particularly excited for tonight's webinar because I have a very special connection with Deborah the prophet. For my bat mitzvah, I studied the 7 female prophets in the Bible, and in particular, Deborah and the Song of Deborah. And I found all of these female prophets to be incredibly inspiring models for how to assume a leadership role, how to take charge, how to fill a void when there is a leadership gap, and more and more and more. And I look forward to learning more about Deborah tonight with all of you. So it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, my friend and colleague, Debra Band. Deborah's work in Hebrew illuminated manuscripts draws upon her love of both the manuscript arts and biblical studies. She holds a BA Honors in History from Concordia University in Montreal and an MS in Political Science from MIT. Deborah's extensive studies of Jewish texts and research into medieval European and Middle Eastern painting and manuscripts inform her work, which includes illuminated and paper-cut books and ketubot. Her work has been featured in exhibits, private collections, community institutions, and galleries across the United States, Canada, England, and South Africa. Deborah is the artist and author of a number of books, including The Song of Songs, The Honeybee in the Garden, I Will Wake the Dawn, Illuminated Psalms, and Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah. And her latest book, Kabbalat Shabbat, The Grand Unification, will appear in September 2016. And with that introduction, I would love to turn the floor over to Debra Band.
Thanks, Rachel. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Lovely, great. It's wonderful to speak with you all tonight. We're going to talk about the Deborah story, which is the 4th and 5th chapters of Shoftim, the book of Judges. Thank you. Very good. Yeah, good. And it has this great distinction of having been chosen as the Haftarah for one of the key parshiot of the whole year, which we'll be reading this Shabbat, the Shalach, which recounts the crossing of the Red Sea, a formative moment for Am Yisrael. Indeed, for Rabbi Akiva, the crossing of the Red Sea was the moment when God and Israel first expressed their love for each other by singing the Song of Songs. And the Deborah story, with its own remarkable leader and its own water miracle and its own moment of nation building, was considered a reminder of the Shalach's themes to our Roman period sages. So let's begin by looking at the structure of the story, its place in Jewish lore, and then explore the character of Deborah and the qualities, hers and her stories, that made her tale so important that it was chosen to accompany this key tale of all of Tanakh. Now, I'm going to discuss the tale in the context of artwork. The images you'll see are from my book, Arise, Arise, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah, which illuminates the 3 women's stories of pre-exile Israel. It was this story, though, Deborah, that was the germ of the whole book. The Deborah story was my late first husband, David's bar mitzvah haftarah, and he just loved it. And at about the time of his passing, a little less than 7 years ago, my father-in-law, the scholar of Hebrew literature, Arnold Band at UCLA, and I decided to do this book together as a kind of matzevah for him. For nearly 30 years, I've built my Hebrew illuminated manuscripts around the interpretation of biblical texts, and I had a wonderful time rediscovering this story that I'd known all my life. And it's great fun to share it with you now. Also, before I go any further, I need to thank Rachel's parents, Sharon and Steve Lieberman, who supported bringing this work to light, and wish the whole family comfort following the recent passing of Sharon's father. So, who is Deborah? This prophet, this tribal leader, this first woman in our entire history who became the centerpiece of her own biblical narrative, the heroine of her own Shirah. Her tale, again, the 4th and 5th chapters of Shoftim, has 2 distinct sections, each in its own chapter. The 4th chapter is a prose narrative, redacted along with the rest of Shoftim, probably early in the Davidic monarchy. The 5th chapter is the epic poem, the Shirah. This is not only the first, but maybe the only epic poem in our tradition that's fully in a woman's voice, and that we can date with full academic credibility, no less, to the actual time of the events. The prose narrative is probably later, but modern scholarship agrees that in the Shirah, it's very likely Deborah's own voice that we hear. In fact, her name not only means honeybee, that's what Deborah means, but also her word, as the Bible scholar Tikva Firmer-Kensky wrote. Her weapon is the word, and her very name is an anagram of she spoke, Deborah. Next slide, please, Rachel. Can you do the next slide? Thank you. There we go. Yep, got it. Okay. The artwork you'll see here has a couple of very special powers to help us explore her personality and the significance of her story. First, the emotional tone of my paintings can flesh out the human emotions of discrete moments of the story more fully than the rather terse narrative itself. Second, in my choice of imagery, you'll see that I can introduce symbolism associated with all kinds of related ideas in Tanakh and rabbinic literature to highlight the whole complex of human, historical, and theological ideas that give the story its value within our tradition. Now, apart from the special powers of the artwork, there are a few other themes that I want you to keep in mind as we re-experience Deborah's story. First, I want you to think about seeing it as a tale from a specifically agrarian society. We were farmers and herders living in the highlands of Israel, not city dwellers. Second, it's really important to keep in mind that we're talking about the 12th century BCE, not only an early time in Jewish history, but an early moment in technological history. This is the transition between the Bronze and the Iron Age, and that plays a critical role here, you'll see. Third, keep in mind that this is the very first coherent woman story in all of Tanakh. Yes, we have Sarah, Rivka, Miriam, and so on, but they are co-stars in their men's stories. This is the first story built around a woman's deeds, and so we should be alert not only to the uniqueness of her role as a 12th century BCE agrarian woman, but also how our chain of male commentators regard her. So we'll see what's so startlingly special about her. Next slide, please. Great, lovely. Okay, so here we have a view of Mount Tabor. Archaeologists have actually found remains of battles during the same period at Tanakh and Megiddo, which are just to the west of this spot. And Deborah's opponent, Sisera, has his base very near at Charoshet HaGoyim, which was probably a flat, dry farming area in the Jezreel Valley. And he would have known this area like the back of his hand. Now, there's a lot about this story that sounds on the surface of things completely preposterous. Deborah's story is all about a battle in which a bunch of farmers and herders took on and defeated a heavy, technologically advanced standing army where, no less, these farmers were led by a woman, and we don't actually even know whether she had sat a horse before. Sounds like theater of the absurd, no? We're going to figure this out and see how and why it does make sense. As we move ahead, I want you to keep a few historical facts at the forefronts of your minds. First, this again is the 12th century BCE, the transition from the Bronze Age to the technologically superior Iron Age. Second, this story concerns Israelite tribes in the central region of Israel, Benjamin, just north of Judea, in a region with no overarching Israelite control. This was a region dominated by Canaanite city-states and under the general loose rule of Egypt. Third, this is an agrarian society. Every person lived very close to the thin, not very fertile soil and the vast night sky. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. Super. Now, Israel faces disaster at the beginning of the Deborah story. And so these paintings begin with a sense of foreboding. During this last quarter of the 12th century BCE, Judges Shoftim tells us, the Israelite tribes have persisted in the wayward behavior they've exhibited ever since leaving Egypt, and they're now paying the price. God withdraws his unseen support, pulls back the strong hand and outstretched arm, and leaves them to suffer the raids of King Yavin. Okay, who's Yavin? The text designation, King of Canaan, is problematic. Canaan was not a unified kingdom at the time, but rather a region of many larger and smaller city-states, each with its own king. A text from Shoftim tells us, V'yimkarem Hashem b'yad Yavin melech Canaan, asher malach b'chatzor v'sar tzva'o Sisra. Israel has offended God, and the Lord surrendered them to King Yavin of Canaan, who reigned in Chatzor. His army commander was Sisra. Now, Yavin is described not as king of all Canaan. There was no such thing, but of the powerful city-state of Chatzor, which was known in the days of Joshua as the head of all those Canaanite kingdoms. These two paintings, Illuminations 1 and 2, portray the threatening reality that now faces the Israelite farming and herding communities. And how is it that the Canaanites threatened the Israelite tribes? In the era of the Judges, the Israelites lived in agricultural and herding communities on the hilltops, while the Canaanites tended to live below in the valleys, which is where the roads were. We can surmise that the Canaanites, led by Yavin and his general Sisera, had been destroying Israelite fields and threatening their trade routes. And so through the window of an as yet secure Israelite home, we see Sisera galloping across the field, his chariot and horses churning up the freshly sprouting grain. Linguistic analysis of his name indicates that he, or at least his name, was not Semitic, but probably from the sea peoples who had come out of Crete to invade the southeastern Mediterranean. The early Philistines seem to have been from that stock. Consequently, I've painted Sisera as a Mycenaean warrior, complete with horsehair crest on his helmet, and of course his iron-reinforced chariot. But for the moment, this Israelite home is still intact. This is a good moment to point your attention to the pottery jars in the foreground of the painting on the left. Any of us who've been to museums of biblical archaeology are familiar with the tall clay jars and amphorae that were used all over the Mediterranean basin for millennia to store everything from grain to oil to mascara to documents. You may remember that the Dead Sea Scrolls, more than 1,000 years after these events, were also stored in clay jars. You may also remember that Lurianic Kabbalah revolves around the notion that in the creation of the world, the shattering of a fragile vessel filled with primordial divine light signaled the introduction of evil into the world. Now, I'm not working directly with Kabbalah here. That's left for the book project that I'm just sending to print now. But in this work, I adapt the image of the vessel, the jar, to indicate Israel's overall mood at a given point in the story. If the vessel is whole, life is good. If cracked or broken, there's fear. While this home is yet safe, its residents undoubtedly fear destruction, and the jars you see here have just begun to crack. Riding toward an Israelite village during the cool of dusk, a traveler might have been startled at the red glow on the hillsides. Look at the right, and you'll see it still smoldering after the day's Canaanite raid. Arcing across the unsettled sky, however, is the limitless cosmos, its innumerable stars, reminding the viewer of the divine promise to Abraham to make his descendants as innumerable as the lights of the heavens. And you'll see the special role that stars play here in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. Beautiful. Okay, so how did the Israelite populace deal with the constant Canaanite threat? We understand from the text that they go to the leader of the day to complain and seek relief. Now, this leader is unique from all the others whose deeds are recorded in Shoftim. This judge or chieftain or governor, however you want to understand the word shofet at this period, this one's a woman. The text tells us, Deborah isha neviah, eshet lapidot, he shofta et Yisrael be'et hahi. Deborah, the wife of Lapidot, was a prophetess. She led Israel at that time. Okay, what do we know about Deborah? We are told almost nothing here, but there are certain things that we can deduce through a very close reading of the text. The text uses this phrase, you just heard, eshet Lapidot, that invariably means the wife of someone named Lapidot, whose name never turns up again, and that she holds court under a palm tree. And we learn shortly that she's influential enough that her general, Barak, won't think of going to war against the Canaanites without her personal involvement. So we really know nothing about who her husband is, but through the linguistic relationship between the word lapidot, which means wicks or torches, and the word barak, lightning, the rabbinic tradition and some modern commentators accept that her husband Lapidot and her general Barak were one and the same man. We know nothing about her in connection with wealth, motherhood, landholding, household management, or success at farming, so her fame can't have anything to do with any of those. Oh, it's a good bet she's not poor. We aren't told that she's some distant oracle, but that people regularly come to her to settle their grievances. She literally held court at a well-understood spot, the palm of Deborah, in the hill country of Ephraim. So her fame and ability to muster a popular army from several tribes, one second, I'm unplugged here, must rest on knowledge of Israel's law and custom, sheer common sense and wisdom, fairness, maybe some charisma too. We don't know how old she is, but she's evidently not tethered by small children, and she can ride off to war. So I surmise that she's in healthy, active middle age like so many of us. She's definitely not some old crone hidden away in a mountaintop shrine like other contemporary oracles. Think of the Greeks. In the Shirah, she will describe herself as a mother in Israel, Em B'Yisrael. But since we're told nothing about children, we understand this in the light of an even earlier Assyrian myth, in which the goddess Ishtar leads the king Ashurbanipal and his people out to battle, wrapped in her lovely baby sling. Or even the way we Americans describe the childless George Washington as the father of the country. Having read all the rest of Shoftim, we also know that Deborah is the only one of the whole lot who is not dreadfully morally compromised and is fully effective. Now, despite all of this heroism in the biblical accounts, the midrash about Deborah is scarce and strikingly ambivalent. The rabbis are clearly extremely uncomfortable with this active woman who leads both her husband and her people and is granted the gift of prophecy at least this once. We're going to talk about that more a bit later. So these paintings introduce her in this light. At right, we see her considering the claims of the wildly upset Israelites who visit her complete with flocks and children. The midrash compares her to a strong house. So at the right, I show her in front of her own stone home, the doorway flanked by her famous palm, the torch symbolizing her husband, and in midrash certain aspects of her own merit, and a potted pink lily. Lily. There's a famous midrash about the giving of the Torah that compares a fragrant rose-colored lily growing in a ruined orchard to the value of the 10 Commandments in a corrupted human world. So here, the lily beside the house alludes to the law by which Deborah guides her people. The broken jar spilling wine and the clouded sky, not to mention the obviously upset villagers, indicate the trouble afoot. At left, we see Deborah and Barak leading the tribal army off to battle. What's happened here? We can surmise from the text that the Israelite farmers and shepherds, again, who primarily live on the hilltops, have come screaming to Deborah that the Canaanites ruled by Yavin, the king of Chatzor, are ruining their livelihood. Ruining crops, stealing livestock, blocking the trade route, so on. The text tells us that Sisera had 900 iron chariots. Remember, this is the turn of the Bronze Age to the iron. Deborah has sent for her general, probably her husband, Barak, and told him that God has commanded her to tell him to bring troops from the tribes of Naphtali and Zvulun to Nachal Kishon, on the banks of the normally dry stream of Kishon near Mount Tabor, where they will conquer Sisera, although Sisera himself would be delivered into the hands of a woman. Barak comes, but refuses to take on Sisera unless Deborah herself comes, for it's only she whom the tribes will follow, but he agrees to the fight. Now think about it. This seems crazy. A scrabble of farmers and herders deliberately provoking battle with heavy iron-reinforced professional army? She really is depending upon a miracle. Where in heaven does her confidence come from? We have no indication that she's received specific prophecies in the past, as Moses had done by the time he led Bnei Israel to the banks of the Red Sea. In fact, Israel has been sunk in one disaster after another during the period of the shofet beforehand. God tells her that Sisera will be vanquished by a woman, but he doesn't tell her how, and in effect presents a rather unusual community leader with a gamble. And you'll see how this mystery unfolds. For the moment, notice the cloudy gray sky and the dust that envelops them as they march through the dry soil. So here we see Deborah and Barak leading their men to battle, armed with little more than sickle swords, one of the major weapons of the day for non-professional armies. Accounts of war so often talk about clouds of dust raised by soldiers' march. And we can imagine the anxiety of these farmers and shepherds as they choke their way through the dust of their bare fields on the way to take on forces that they could only have found wildly intimidating. I've composed this scene, incidentally, in a manner reminiscent of Egyptian and Mesopotamian friezes that often show different aspects of the events in 2 or 3 registers or rows of illustrations. So let's move on. Next slide, please. Yep, okay. The battle. We know what happens here, but the real question is why. How on earth does Deborah pull this off? How is it that God helps her? So the forces meet at the bank of Nachal Kishon, the ordinarily dry riverbed of the Kishon River. It's a vadi. It's generally a vadi. You can think of our western arroyos. It's much the same thing. And here is Deborah's gamble. So, God has told her to lead the troops there and that they'll prevail. And somehow her far inferior force is going to smash the mighty Canaanite army. Deborah's been told she'll prevail, but not how. I am certain that she must be praying for rain and mud. Sisera, on the other hand, must be assuming that the weather is still dry, or there is no way on earth that he would have taken his 900 iron chariots anywhere near a stream. I'm sure that Deborah is hoping for rain that will swamp these heavy chariots, but not her own light and nimble foot troops, while Sisera, who remember must have known this land really well, Sisera blithely figures that his strong forces can simply mow down those annoying farmers. So it would seem that this story takes place at the very beginning of winter when the rains might or might not have begun, and both leaders can assume that they have the advantage. And God is indeed behind Deborah and Barak. The rains start. We'll in fact see soon in the Shirah, the epic poem, how all the forces of nature join in. Sisera's chariots get mired in the mud. His soldiers, who would have been armed with long-distance weapons like spears and bows and arrows, are close to helpless, and the Israelite foot soldiers can run in and just pick them off. At right, we see the chaos of battle. Soldiers have always described the experience of battle as an altered reality. And we all talk about seeing red when we're angry, and that's what I painted here. Archaeologically, got it out there, correct swords, spears, bows and arrows, battle horses, and chariots crash together in a wild, vicious melee. Let's consider the emotions for just a moment. Deborah and Barak's troops probably weren't the first, and they definitely aren't the last soldiers to experience the chaos and altered consciousness of battle. Soldiers and poets of war from Homer on have always described altered states during battle. Let me offer you something very contemporary. Here's the Iraq war soldier and poet Brian Turner. This is a poem called 2,000 Pounds from his 2005 book, Your Bullet. Sergeant Ledoux of the National Guard speaks but cannot hear the words coming out, and it's just as well his eardrums ruptured because it lends the world a certain calm. Though the traffic circle is filled with people running in panic, their legs in a blur like horses in a carousel, turning and turning the way tires spin on the Humvee flip to its side. So you can imagine the disorientation and fear, and also the bloodlust as the Israelite farmers under Barak's command face the charging Canaanite charioteers until they hit the mud. Sisera escapes the rout and runs off. Thirsty, hungry, probably trembling from exhaustion and rage and fear, he finds a Bedouin encampment, goes in and begs for water. Now, this is not just any Bedouin encampment. This is the tent of Heber HaKeni, Heber the Canaanite, and his wife Yael. Why is the Canaanite designation important here? The rabbinics tell us that Cain's descendants, yes, this is Adam's son Cain, still worshipped God. They're not idolaters, although they did not follow Israel's law. So, acting on a loose alliance with the Israelites, Yael invites Sisera in to rest. And instead of just giving him water, gives him a flask of milk to drink. It's worth noting that the rabbis use this moment as an occasion to reflect on the treachery of women. One of the few midrashic sources on the Deborah story, Pseudo-Philo, who wrote in 1st century CE, Babylonia, Israel, or Rome, we don't really know where, described how Yael seduced Sisera with beauty, jewels, perfume, and of course, choice food, offering him milk in a princely bowl. Get this. When Yael saw him approach, she went to meet him arrayed in rich garments and jewels. She was unusually beautiful, and her voice was the most seductive ever a woman possessed. These are the words she addressed to him. Enter and refresh thyself with food, and sleep until evening, and then I will send my attendants with thee to accompany thee, for I know thou wilt not forget me, and thy recompense will not fail. When Sisera, on stepping into her tent, saw the bed strewn with roses which Yael had prepared for him, he resolved to take her home to his mother as his wife, as soon as his safety should be assured. Right. Now, Pseudo-Philo's Yael sounds a whole lot more like a Roman courtesan than like a Bedouin wife. Although we know who the villain is here, it's masculine fear of the femme fatale that we see expressed so lasciviously here, with even a touch of empathy for Sisera, rather than gratitude for this woman's courage, whether specifically in Israel's interests or in self-defense. Oops, did I say self-defense? The prose narrative and the Shirah diverge here. Each infers a slightly different version of what happened in Yael's tent. The prose tells us that once Sisera fell asleep, Yael stealthily picked up a long, sharp tent peg and using a mallet that she was able to grab, nailed it through Sisera's head, and he died. V'tikach Yael eshet Heber et yatat ha'ohel v'tasem et hamakevet biyada, v'tavo elav belat, v'titka et hayated v'rakato, v'titznach ba'aretz, v'hu nirdam v'yaf v'yamot. Then Yael, wife of Heber, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground. Thus he died. Okay, so that's the prose narratives account. That's in chapter 4. And that's what we tend to think about, what we tend to remember nowadays. The Shirah, now remember, this is the far earlier text. That says something a little different. Bein ragleha kara nafal shachav, bein ragleha kara nafal ba'asher, kara sham nafal shadud. Between her feet he sank, lay still. Where he sank, there he lay, destroyed. Now, the Bible scholar Diane Sharon, who's presently compiling JPS's commentary on Judges, teaching a class some years ago, walked through the choreography of Yael's attack described in the Shirah and realized that this text only makes sense if we understand that Sisera must have awakened and attempted to rape Yael. If she'd attacked him while he slept, of course, there would have been no place for him to have fallen. Diane understands that the text implies that Sisera attempted to rape Yael, perhaps after waking up from sleep. The author or redactor of the prose narrative clearly intended Yael's act to be seen as an unexpected and heroic, deliberate defense of Israel. And so the prose has her initiating the attack on Israel's enemy. The rabbis consider the possibility that Yael had relations with Sisera, and not necessarily rape, but generally attempt to reconcile the two accounts by saying that he fell down asleep before she took up the hammer and peg. Next slide, please. Thank you. Lovely. Okay. So, after the chaos of battle, Deborah's leadership, and Yael's individual courage, the prose tells us that Deborah's prophecy has been fulfilled. Look to the illumination on the right. Israel has achieved peace. The tribal armies are free to return to their herding, farming, and trading unmolested. The sprig of caper plant tells us of Israel's ability to persevere through every adversity. This draws upon a short discussion recorded in the Babylonian Talmud that compares several plants and animals to various qualities of Israel. The rabbi saw in this scrubby plant that today springs from the stones of the Kotel and wadis like Ein Gedi, and despite scarce water and nutrients, could put out a fresh bud and fresh blossom every day. They compare the caper to Israel's quality of perseverance, with only faith in God to support us. The eagle feathers embracing the calm scene remind us that the God who brought Israel across the Red Sea as though on wings of eagles is the same caring parent who sees his people through these trials. And now for something completely different. Look left. As the narrative ends, Shirat Devorah, Devorah's epic song begins. Deborah sings of how when people completely devote themselves to God, God responds to them with all the forces of nature. And that mighty Canaanite army better watch out. And this, of course, is one of the great water miracles. And so it was matched with Beshalach as its Haftarah. In these paintings, I've attempted to portray the glorious chaos of battle that Deborah describes and the way she creates her own legend in the Shirah. In this first illumination of the epic, which again is chapter 5 of Judges Shoftim, we see at top the cloudburst that floods Nachal Kishon, which is ordinarily a wadi. It's a flash flood, and the licking, grabbing tentacles of its waters run throughout these pages. Earth quakes and cracks in the face of the divine power evident in the flood, and an eagle soars overhead, again drawing upon the image of God rescuing Israel as though on wings of eagles, as in Shirat Hayam in Shmot in Exodus, the Song of the Sea. A fortified wall crumbles in the waves. And where am I? Fortified wall crumbles in the waves as a Canaanite statuette of a god or a king, and weaponry are sucked under. Next slide, please. Terrific. Lovely. Okay. Uri, Uri, Dvorah. Uri, Uri, Dabri Shir. Awake, awake, O Deborah, the chieftain and judge cries out. Awake, awake, strike up the chant. In this epic, Deborah addresses not her community directly, but herself. She tells herself to mark these deeds in song, and she creates her own legend that, of course, still reverberates today. I'm interested in the interplay between the kernels of human experience and the legend in the poem. And I try to express this by painting parts of the poem like a masonry frieze. The frieze at the right on Illumination 9 is adapted from an Egyptian relief depicting the roughly contemporary 13th century Battle of Kadesh, in which Ramses II fought a Hittite force. In the lowest register, though, I show peaceful trading, while at top, the sculptural form of Devorah juts out of legend into reality. At left in Illumination 10, we again see Deborah exhorting the Israelite tribes to action as the Canaanite soldiers, chariots, and flailing horses' hooves sink beneath the waves. Now, you see the stars overhead? It's worth saying something about them. One of the striking things here is that while the narrative just briefly describes the charge, the song evokes a dynamic image of all the forces of nature conspiring to win the day for the Israelites. The clouds drip and pour. The general's name means lightning. The earth shakes, the stream floods, and then in verse 20, Min shamayim nilchamu hakochavim, mim silotam nilchamu im Sisra. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. Now, I was married to an astrophysicist for 30 years. Stars mean something, and I just can't leave that juicy bit alone. How could the distant stars appear to fight? These guys knew the difference between lightning and stars. To me, though, this sounds like a meteor shower. If you've ever lain outside in a desert or a meadow or on the hood of a car in the middle of the California wilderness to watch a meteor shower, you know how bizarre and extraordinary it is to watch streaks of light unpredictably shooting overhead. Now, I remembered that the Leonid meteor shower occurs just at the beginning of winter each year, which in Israel is also the beginning of the rainy season. I double-checked with an astronomer colleague of my late husband's, and he agreed that it's just possible that if this battle did happen, and if it was during early winter, this verse could very well be describing the Leonids seeming to come to Israel's aid. So this detail seems to me like confirmation of the timing of this battle, of Deborah's genius at choosing the moment for her gamble, the very beginning of the winter rains. Next slide, please. Okie dokie. These pages present the end of the Shirah, the end of the Deborah story. At right, we see the epic's view of not the simple skin of milk as in the prose narrative, but the lordly cup that Yael offered Sisera as he fell at her feet. The poem ends with a sardonic, blackly humorous image of Sisera's mother waiting at her window for him to come home laden with booty, such as wonderful embroidered cloth and slave girls for every man. It's not a sweet motherly image. She's incredibly vulgar and vicious. They must be dividing the spoil they have found, she says. A girl or two for each man, spoil of dyed cloth for Sisera, spoil of embroidered cloths round every neck as spoil. Except the word she uses is not girl. Instead, she says racham rachmatayim, wombs and wombs. And you might be able to imagine the debasing slang English that this phrase probably represented. And these girls are nothing more than spoil of war, and that's just fine with her. Not the sweet motherly image. So I imagine her as a shrill, spidery creature crouched, as you can see, behind her window screen as the embroidery she imagines pours from her sill. There's just a hint of the side of one of the imagined slaves at the bottom, next to the images of her son's real achievement, chariots and shields stuck in the mud of the miraculously flash-flooded stream, whose waters still lick around the ruins. Now, this repellent mother character contrasts sharply with the character of Deborah. Deborah, of course, describes herself as a mother in Israel. As we saw earlier, a figure of national nurturing and care, in line with heroic women and goddess figures in the nearby Mesopotamian culture. Sister's mother is simply ugly, and for all her harsh bluster, she doesn't know that her son, Israel's enemy, has been ignominiously felled by the hand of another woman. At left, we see the end of the Shirah. Dvorah's and the Israelites' solid walls reach upward, and the clay jars storing their crops rest safely within. The eagle, again symbolizing God's protection of Israel, flies upward. The mosaic painting depicts the sun rising behind Mount Tabor. Notice, though, that the scene is illuminated not by a natural sun, but from the man-made mosaic image of the sun, just as our tradition has been illuminated ever since, not simply by the events of this story themselves, but by the human creation, the legend Deborah wove around her deeds. So, there we are. This Shabbat, even after we finish reading about Miriam and her own courage and tambourines, we have two more great women heroes to celebrate this Shabbat. Thanks very much, and I'm happy to open up for questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Deborah, for sharing that with us. I think that it definitely added a lot of color to the story for us, and it was also very exciting to really see all of the intricacies of all of the paintings and the illuminations, and to hear how there is a story behind each component in the illustration. I know that added a lot for me. So we have a number of questions that have come in from the audience, and I'd encourage everybody, if you have questions, please use the form underneath the screen to submit them. And the first one is, what, if anything, did you learn about Deborah and about Yael through your research that you found surprising, or that was different than the narrative that you had in your head before you started your research?
Let's see. The rape idea was, of course, something that had never occurred to me. I mean, this is something that Diane Sharon, who became a friend in the process of working on this book, had uncovered, as I said. I really had only paid attention to the narrative before, to the prose. And frankly, for many, many years, my primary association with the story altogether didn't even relate to my name. It related to memories of hearing my husband practicing it before he chanted it at every possible occasion. But it's a fascinating story. I am looking at it as a historical text of the transition between the Bronze and Iron Age, the importance of the technological advancement in Israel's history was really quite wonderful. Just paying attention to the whole thing was just fascinating.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question was, you mentioned the big difference between the prose and the song when it came to the depiction of Yael. Were there any other striking differences that you came across throughout your research?
The experience of war is probably different. The prose narrative doesn't discuss it very much, but when you think it through, these guys really must have been terrified. Mm-hmm. This was a pretty stiff assignment that they were given. And whereas the Shirah only talks about the glory. You know, she's built her legend. You know, she built a legend out of Israel's exploits and out of her leadership of Israel here. Mm-hmm. And so I think seeing the difference between the glory and what the actual reality, having studied the situation of the Israelite tribes and what that kind of war really meant to them, it was very interesting to see the contrast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. The next question is, how do you come up with the ideas and the symbolisms for the paintings?
Ah, very nice. Okay. It's very important to me to develop a symbolic vocabulary for Judaism. It's something that medieval Christians developed very, very early on, but Judaism never did, for all kinds of solid historical reasons, but I think is relevant now. So I try to tell the story through visual symbols that represent other sort of intangible ideas. And the way I go about putting my paintings together is when can you hear? I touched something inappropriately. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. When I start working on a text, I go through. I study the pshat of the text. I study the rabbinics at the same time that I study the academic biblical scholarship on it. I want to see it through two lenses, and I go into the archaeology of the period, and then I go into the midrash. Midrash is an extraordinarily rich source of all kinds of associated symbolic ideas. And as you saw in these paintings, I can pull things out from midrash about the giving of the Ten Commandments. I can pull things out from midrash about Shirat Hayam. I can pull out fairly random little rabbinic discussions about the way certain plants and animals symbolize different qualities of Israel, and use ideas taken from all these rabbinic discussions to highlight and introduce other values that are expressed implicitly. I should say are implicit in the text, but not actually expressed. So that's how I put things all together. That lily comes from actually it's a midrash in Vayikra Rabbah. The caper is from a little passage in the Bavli, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you for sharing that with us. The next question is, it seems that Deborah's song does not go into the gory details of battle, unlike the Greek epics. Why do you think this is?
I can't tell you. For one thing, it's brief. You know, I've recently read the Iliad and the Odyssey over again, and yes, they go on forever glorifying the details of battle. This is a much, much shorter song than those books. And I think Deborah is the narrative is that the prose is very, very terse. It just doesn't give us a lot of detail about anything. The Shirah, Deborah is bent on expressing the glory of the battle and the glory of God's support of her in leading the people. And I think the details of the battle just didn't come to it, didn't come into it for her.
Okay.
But again, you imagine what's going on and really try to think it through. And there's all kinds of stuff there.
Okay. The next question is, since you had mentioned that this is really a unique story of a female judge and that the men are in the backdrop, do you have any theories about why this particular story was included, as it's so different from the other stories that we have in Judges?
That's a good question. I can't answer that. It may have been popular. There's a lot of thought on the same idea about Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is a pretty anomalous text. And there are theories that the midrashic understanding of it may have been introduced very early, or realized very early, But people loved it, and I think that may very well have been the case here as well. And it's a very strong story of God coming to Israel's aid. But there's another way of looking at that, though, which is not especially pleasant, and that is to show the point of shoftim overall is to show how hopeless Israel was at governing itself without a king, and to show that the only success they had during this whole period was under the hands of a woman. I mean, is a way of showing, not that I like this, obviously, none of us do, but it's a way of showing how low the people really had sunk and how desperately they needed a king. So the rabbis were not happy about a woman ruler. Not that they were unique in their time.
Right. Okay. We have a technical question. You had referred to your paintings. Can you talk about what media you work in?
Sure. These are classic European-style illuminated manuscripts. I paint these in very much the same way that European illuminators, Jewish and Christian, have been doing decorated books since the beginning of the Codex in around the year 1000. The paintings are done on kosher cloth. This is actually, what I use is called slunk vellum. It's the finest of all parchment. It's the skin from a very, very young calf. I get my stuff from a sofer in Israel. The paints are gouache. The gold is 23 karat leaf. Any silver that you see is actually palladium leaf, because palladium, unlike silver, does not tarnish. And you actually see that in illuminated manuscripts. The British Library is full of these gorgeous, 15th and 16th century Persian manuscripts with little silver rivers running through them, except they're not silver anymore, they're black. So I use palladium instead. And I start first with text. I do the text first, and then I paint, and then I gild. So these are very classical illuminated manuscripts.
Great, thank you. So our last question is, are there any images or ideas that you wanted to incorporate in your manuscript that you were unable to include for length or for other reasons, and can you share any of that with us?
Oh, that's interesting. I don't remember any frustration along those lines. I mean, the story is so rich in emotion. And I should say, the way when I was first presented with the idea of working on Shirat Dvorah, I was completely, in fact, all these three stories in the book, Deborah, Ruth, and Hannah, I was completely thrown because I had never worked with prose texts before. I'd always worked with poetry. And I didn't really have a good way into it. And I was lying in bed one night, having picked up Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, which I'd had on my shelf for a very long time and never actually bothered to pick up. I opened it up, and within an hour, it hit me that the way to approach these stories was by focusing on the very strong emotions in them. And that just unlocked everything. And I found each of them tremendously rich to deal with. I mean, the Deborah story has these emotions about dread and about the bloodlust and chaos of battle, and then complete calm and serenity. And so that was sort of my way into working on all of this, and I found it very, very rich. I really did not find it frustrating. There are other projects. I mean, I have other projects where I've ached and found really artificial ways of dealing, for instance, with Yechezkel's Valley of Dry Bones story, which I really love. but that's been with other projects. This one, it was very satisfying.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us, Deborah. I think that you've given us a lot of really interesting and inspiring things to think about, especially as we go into Shabbat Shirah and read this portion on Shabbat as the Haftorah.
Yeah, enjoy it. Pay attention to it. It's great fun.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to remind everybody who's watching that if you enjoyed this presentation, we have a special discount on the book available to JOFA supporters. And we'll be sending out another link to that after the conclusion of this webinar. There's a special promotion where you get about 70% off of the book. And if you enjoyed these illuminations, I'd really encourage you to check it out and to see what else you're missing in the book. And second of all, I want to say that I really hope that you enjoyed this webinar. We offer webinars about every month or every other month, and I encourage you to continue to stay engaged in JOFA. I hope that you'll sign up for our mailing list, you'll follow us on social media, and perhaps you'll even join us for an in-person event at some point. So thank you again to Deborah for joining us tonight and for sharing these stories with us, and thank you to all of you for joining us. And we hope that you have a lovely evening, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you.
Stay warm and dry if you're on the East Coast.
Good night.